All right, today we're going to take a look at Southeast Asia. This is a part of the world we have not looked at before. And so we'll take a look at this today. Then on Thursday, we're going to move on to the next chapter, because remember, this is a special week where we're doing 2 chapters in 1 week. This is the only week we do that. Now, Southeast Asia has its own interesting history, because it really is a mixing of cultures. Big influences are going to be China and India, especially in these early periods, because people from India will move into Southeast Asia, sometimes for trade, sometimes because of religion. You'll have missionaries, if you want to call them, not Christian missionaries, but say Buddhist missionaries. Because remember, from India, Hinduism is a native religion, an early religion, and Buddhism. Buddhism is a kind of modified or reformed Hinduism. They are related. But Buddhism is evangelistic, if you will. They send missionaries, try to recruit people to their position. Thanks. So that brings them into Southeast Asia. Also, China will come into this area. In fact, some Buddhist missionaries go from India to China and from China to Southeast Asia. So there's a lot of mixing of cultures, mixing of languages, mixing of religion, mixing of architecture and art. Now, one of the things you have to remember in Southeast Asia is that they have geographically a lot of mountains. There are several mountain ranges in Southeast Asia that run roughly north to south. Not exactly north-south, but sort of northwest to southeast. Now, I don't know if you've ever lived in a place where they have mountains or ridges, big hills with ridges. If you grew up in Florida, I would say the answer is no. You have not. I grew up in northern Indiana. The answer there is also no. It's very flat in the northern part of Indiana, Illinois, and so forth. But I lived for a long time in Kentucky, and I spent time in West Virginia and so forth. There are a lot of mountains and hills there. And one of the things I can tell you that mountains and hills do is that they divide people. Because it's not easy to go over those mountains, those ridges, and those hills. So you might only live a mile or 2 away from somebody, but if they've got a big mountain there, it'll take you a long time to get to their house. And you're going to have much more contact with people that are along the same elevation as you rather than geographic distance, if that makes any sense. So it's easier to go up and down a valley than it is to go up and over a hill. Okay? So that's really what we see here, and that also is a factor, because that will divide people into sort of cultures that, when you look at it, if you look at it without the mountains, you'd say, well, those people are very close to each other. Why don't they have more connection? When you look at it with the mountains, then you start to see why they don't. So really the connections then come, like in any mountainous or hilly area, it's going to come with the valleys, Cultures will, and here is just a picture to give you an idea of the terrain, how mountainous and hilly it can be, and how that might divide people, and it certainly does. In eastern Kentucky, where I lived, bless you, they have what we called hills and hollers. Maybe you never heard of that. A holler is a valley between hills or ridges. And the people in the holler definitely know each other a lot more than the guy the next holler over. Okay? Okay? Anyway, just to give you an example from the U.S. Well, this basically means that travel east-west is difficult. Travel north-south is easier. So you're going into valleys. All right, that makes sense. So we need to understand that as we begin to try to understand what's going on in Southeast Asia. Now here is a map of the area that we're talking about. Southeast Asia is the areas of, well, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, Burma, all the way down to Malaysia. And then, of course, there's a whole host of islands that are here that you may well have heard of. I don't know how much you've studied this or are familiar with this geography, but there is Indonesia, a group of quite a few islands here, Malaysia, Philippines, and there are other smaller islands out here as well. So generally, when people say Southeast Asia, they're talking about the area south of China, east of India, and north of Australia, which would be off our picture here, off our map here. Okay? Southeast Asia. Now here are some pictures of the area. And life can be very different if you live in the mountains or the hills or if you live in the lowlands. In the lowlands, this is where the food is grown. I show you two pictures here, both of the same kind of activity. Any idea what's going on here?
Rice.
It's rice, yeah. They are growing rice. The bottom picture shows two women planting rice in what's called a rice paddy, P-A-D-D-Y, a rice paddy. And rice is an unusual plant in that it must be cultivated in the beginning fully submerged, or at least the bottom of it needs to be submerged in water. Most plants do not do well. If you have a garden and you're planting your garden in this kind of condition, probably not going to do too well. But for rice, it's necessary. So they actually, you can see it here. That's why I like this picture. And then here you can see what it's like when it's grown. Is you have little rows, you have divides between the fields or the rice paddies. These are then used to hold the water in. Water has to be pumped or poured into this area to flood it. And it's not flooded very high. It's like ankle high. And then the plants are taken in clumps and they're planted in this. So you see it's very labor intensive because you have to build these little walls, which takes time and effort. You have to flood this, which is also labor intensive depending on what kind of equipment, how you're trying to do it. And then planting it, you can see, very labor intensive, back-breaking labor, I suppose. You're bending over like this and planting it in. Now, once that gets started this way, you don't have to keep the field flooded throughout that whole period. And then it begins to grow, and up here it looks a lot like wheat, if you've seen wheat fields or things like that. This is really a rice field. But then again, harvesting of the rice traditionally was very labor intensive as well. You had to go and cut it. They would cut it by hand with a sickle, and you'd have to gather it up. Then you'd have to beat the rice off of the heads of the plants, much like you have to do with wheat or barley. And then, of course, the rice, it gets in the style, the form that you're more accustomed to, where you would have to cook it that way, all right? So you can cook it and eat it like that. You can pulverize it and make it into a flour. Use it in different ways. But no, typically it's boiled, right? We boil the rice, get it soft so you can eat it. Well, in the lowland areas, which gets separated from these mountainous areas. As we said, rice is the important crop. And in fact, in Southeast Asia, certainly in China and other places like that, rice is the main food, the staple that people consume the most in their daily lives. Much like in the West, in Europe and the West, we tend to eat wheat, right? So when you eat bread, have a slice of bread, it's typically wheat bread. Or, don't have too much barley bread that you sell, but stuff you go to the store and buy, almost all of it is wheat bread, right? Might be some rye, but that's mostly what we eat. Wheat, maybe barley, maybe some rye. These are all what we eat. Now, of course, obviously today, our cuisine is all, homogenized or internationalized, whatever you want to call it. So we do eat a lot of rice as well. But this staple crop for them was rice for many, many years. So the other thing we need to remember is that geography will hinder unity. We saw this when we talked about ancient Greece. I don't know if you can remember back in the deep recesses of your mind to probably August or early September when we talked about Greece. And so that was a long time ago now. That was 2 months ago, 6-7 weeks. We talked about it, and we said that actually helped the Greeks to become independent. This is usually what you find in mountainous areas. People become independent. They have to be more self-sufficient. Out of necessity, really. Now, the other big thing that really can make this confusing and causes the mixing of people, I told you it's a very mixed area, are the migrations. This map is trying to show you early migrations of people. People going from, say, China and Southeast Asia, going in different waves out down these peninsula, out onto these islands, and even on down to Australia. And in this course, we don't talk a lot about Australia. So if you want to write and complain to the textbook company, there would be a complaint. Not enough Australia. Anthropologists believe that there were two main migrations of people in Southeast Asia. The first one were people coming out of China. About the 3rd millennium BC. So this would be all the way back, say, to the times we were talking about with early Mesopotamia, around 3000 BC or so. People moved, and they moved on out and all the way out to some of the islands here, like, say, Taiwan. Taiwan's right about there. And then some people moved on out to the other islands. Like I said, it's very mixed, and it's somewhat confusing. We don't have a lot of documentation. So a lot of what people are going by are languages, different language groups, different cultural indicators to try to figure out when people moved to these places. So they moved out to Taiwan, out to the Philippines, out to Indonesia. These are all the places of the first migration. First big migration. All right? Then we have a second migration. Second group from China, which moves later, probably around 2000 BC, 1500 BC. Here people are going to move out to the South Pacific Islands. Places like Fiji, Tonga, Samoa, New Zealand. These would be the ancestors of the Polynesian cultures. Here we see a picture of a man from Papua New Guinea in traditional dress. You can see he's sort of decorated his face and his beard, his hair. So there are several different islands in this Polynesian culture as well. So we don't have time here to talk about all of these in detail, but most people believe the migrations came from Asia and they moved out to these islands. In many cases, people moving from island to island, bringing with them certain food, certain animals, so that when they got to the new island, they'd have something to eat that they were familiar with. This is often called island hopping. The people would build boats, sometimes outrigger kind of boats, sometimes hollowed out log like canoes, sometimes with an outrigger so they would be more stable in the ocean. And they'll move even as far away as what we see here, Easter Island. Now, Easter Island is about halfway between China and South America. It's a long ways away from Asia, but pretty far from South America as well. One of the most famous things on Easter Island are these statues that I have pictured here. You've probably seen pictures of them. The Easter Island statues have now been more fully excavated. For a long time, it was just mainly the heads and the sort of the shoulders you could see. They've actually excavated them down now, and they find that they are full standing statues. This is some 2,500 miles west of South America. Yet items on the islands appear to have been brought from Asia. Different foods, plants, and even animals appear on these islands. For example, bananas, banana plants, did not originate here, but you do find them here. Another plant called breadfruit, which is a kind of a tree that has a sort of bulbous fruit that grows on it, starchy. You can break that off and cut it. What's that? Oh, yeah, there's different ways you can eat it. But anyway, it becomes a good foodstuff. And this is believed to have been brought from place to place. Seedlings or plants, and then planted, and then of course it multiplies there. Yams, or what's sometimes called sweet potatoes, also obviously grow well in a variety of conditions and produce, as you've probably seen, tubers that you can eat. You can boil them or bake them. Of course, for Thanksgiving you might have some. I don't know what you eat at Thanksgiving, but a lot of people eat sweet potatoes or yams in a casserole of some kind. If you haven't tried them, well, then I recommend them to you. And then, of course, animals. Pigs, dogs, and chickens. These are brought out to these islands. You find them on these remote islands. Chickens, by the way, are believed to have come from Asia, probably China originally, and then been spread by people, really, because a chicken is about the perfect animal to eat. Why do I say that? Because the chicken is small, relatively easy to care for, and once you prepare it, you can pretty much eat a whole chicken in a day. So you don't have to refrigerate it. They don't have refrigeration. You don't have to prepare it to store it. You know, if you take a 800-pound cow or something, or even sheep, and prepare it, that's an awful lot of food to eat for, say, one family. You're not going to eat all that before it goes bad. So you're going to have to do something with it. You're either going to have a whole bunch of people over to eat with you, or you're going to have to salt it or preserve it in some way. Of course, what we tend to do is refrigerate and freeze. They didn't have those options. But a chicken, you know, it's about the right size for a lot of families that you can eat it up in one meal or a couple of meals in a day, and you don't have to worry about it going bad. On my grandmother's farm, she had chickens. And those chickens would wander about the farm. There was a chicken coop where we put them in at night. That was mainly to protect the chickens. I wouldn't call it a chicken prison. It was a chicken sanctuary because, you know, there were a lot of animals that wanted to eat the chickens, like a fox or something. And so by putting them in a coop, having a building where they could get inside, it protected them from the elements, and it also protected them from hawks and foxes and wolves and coyotes and all that kind of stuff, okay? But on my grandmother's farm, when the chickens kind of knew who would normally come, if they saw a car coming down the lane that they did not recognize, the chickens got very nervous. Because when a car came down the lane that they didn't recognize, they knew what often happened. My grandmother would go out in the yard to obtain the preparations for dinner. And the chicken was usually on the menu, okay? If the preacher comes after church on Sunday to eat, there is a sacrificial bird, which is usually offered up for the preacher, and that's a chicken. So the one chicken would say to the other, you know, I don't know if you can outrun them. And the chicken said, I don't have to outrun them. I just got to outrun you. My grandmother would, I won't describe it, but she would grab the chicken. Next thing you know, you had fried chicken for dinner, usually with mashed potatoes. And she made milk gravy. You ever heard of milk gravy? You make it in the frying pan, put a little flour and put a little milk in there. Maybe some beans or corn. You had yourself a nice dinner. Well, you could eat up a chicken in a dinner. Sometimes you might need 2 chickens. But what I'm saying is, chickens are easily transported and they are easily consumed without a lot of preparation. You know, I've gone to the Middle East for many, many years, and people in the Middle East, in Jordan, love chicken. But they don't like to buy chicken like we do in the store, already, as the British would say, dispatched. They want to look their chicken in the eye They want to make sure it's a fresh chicken. And there's one way to make sure it's a fresh chicken, and that is pick it out yourself. And so when we would ride on these little buses, they're really like vans, we'd ride on these little vans and we would stop. The guy would ask the driver to stop when they had they have these crates out front, that's where they had the chickens. He would go in there and pick his chicken. The guy would take care of the chicken right there, hand it to him, he'd get back on a little van and we'd drive away. He took that home for dinner that night. And he could tell his wife, that was a good looking chicken. And you can't get much fresher. You know, it's only been dispatched about a half an hour by the time you got home. Cook it up for dinner. Well, there's my pitch for chickens. But this, you know, you want to know why did chickens spread all over the world? We got chickens everywhere now. Right? There's hardly a place where there aren't chickens. That's because chickens are good survivors and they're also fairly easy to manage. And, like I said, they're a good size to deal with. Chickens, pigs. Pigs can also be taken from island to island. Pigs can forage. You know, if you come with me out to excavate over here in the beautiful Polk County, we drive right by a place that got a big sign that says they go out and hunt wild pigs. We got wild pigs down in Polk County. You got to be careful when you're hunting the wild boars and the pigs. They can be pretty mean. And they're really quick. And they're unbelievably strong, and they hold a grudge. So keep all that in mind. But a pig, you can put him out on an island like that, let the pig forage, and you go hunting for it. You don't even have to take care of the pig. And then you can have a big celebration. Everybody comes and eats the pig. When I lived in North Carolina, we used to have what they called pig pickings. Anybody here ever heard of that? A pig picking? No? That's where they would actually roast an entire pig. Have a big party, they would have everybody come over, and they'd have it on a big spit, and you just come over and pick off the stuff from the spit. You know, put it on your plate, along with whatever else, mashed potatoes or potato salad, whatever you got. And that was a pig picking, and I can tell you that's pretty good eating, if you like pigs. Well, pigs spread from place to place because they are, again, low maintenance to take care of a pig. Pigs can take care of themselves. Now, pigs are pretty smart, so you got to be careful. But pigs also will eat about anything and produce quite a bit of meat, food, for low impact, low amount of work. The biggest work is catching the pig. Get on my grandmother's farm, she had a pig lot. If you don't know what any of this stuff is, well, I'll just mention it to you. But it's basically she had some hogs, a hog lot. And the hogs, you just basically feed them, give them water, and they just took care of the rest. But when it came time to take those pigs to the market, you had to get them on the truck. The pigs knew something was up. They did not want to get on that truck. So I can remember my uncle out in the pig lot. Let's just say the pig won. My uncle was out in the mud, and the pig was running away. And we eventually got some of the pigs in there. But anyway, that's the biggest challenge with a pig. It's not, feeding them or whatever. You can feed them about anything, and they, give them water and food, and they'll do well. And what about dogs? Well, I hate to say it, but some people say dogs are delicious. They eat dogs. Yes, they do. There is a particular breed of dog that is preferred in Asia. and they cook it up. So dogs may be your best friend, but they can also be your lunch, I guess, in some societies. And so dogs are very interesting creatures, I think. Typically, dogs have been companions of humans, helpers of humans, helping to herd, sheep and do other things. You never hear of a seeing eye cat. Have you ever heard of a seeing eye cat? Or like a service cat that's going to come and rescue people or something, sniff out people and rescue them from a building that collapses. It's always the dogs. So, of course, I'm a dog lover, as you might know if you came to my house. So it does pain me, but it is true. People do eat dogs. And that's part of the reason dogs have made their way to these islands. All right. Enough about that. But you see, the evidence of the migrations come sometimes through the foods and the animals, the plants, that we find spread far beyond what could have happened without some help. Right? Chickens are not great flying birds, and they're not good swimmers. So how did they get from island to island? Basically, people took them. You can tie their legs together and carry them. You can put them in a little basket, a little cage, carry them that way. Plus, chickens give you eggs. So chickens provide eggs, they provide meat, they provide lovely companionship. If you've ever gazed into the eyes of a chicken, you'll know what I'm talking about. You probably haven't had the encounters with chickens that I have. They are not clean animals, let me tell you that. All right, we'll just leave it at that. Southeast Asia is very complicated, therefore, and we will not end that complication here today. But I do want you to at least be aware of the complications. Because of these migrations, and because of the geography, divided by mountains, divided by oceans, divided by miles of terrain, very complicated. And then, of course, multiple migrations of people. This also then leads to scores, perhaps hundreds of languages and dialects in Southeast Asia. There are more languages per square mile, let's say, in Southeast Asia than anywhere else in the world, than any other comparable area by size. And so you see this little diagram. I don't expect you to learn that diagram, but that diagram is there to show you the relationship between different languages and dialects. That one can branch off of another, and then branch off to another, and branch off yet to another. And that's really what's happening here. So it's very complicated. For example, there are some people in the world who are trying to translate the Bible into every language of the world. You heard about this? One of their biggest challenges is Southeast Asia. Because in Southeast Asia there are so many languages and dialects, it's quite difficult. Also, many of those languages and dialects are not even written down. There is no writing that goes with the spoken language. So how do you then convey the Bible to them? Typically what these people do is they have to invent a way to write a language that's not been written. And then they have to learn the language, then invent a way to represent it in some form of writing, then take the Bible, the Old and New Testament, and translate it into that language so that it can be understandable to the people. That's a lot of work. It's not an easy task. I met a woman who was working on that kind of a project. I believe she was in Papua New Guinea. And so she was working with a group of people. She had learned the language, and she had been working with others to create a written form of that language. And then she was in the process of translating the Old Testament into that language. So she was talking about some of the challenges of trying to do that. One of the things that she talked about, I remember from her presentation, was talking about the tabernacle. Now, those of you who know what the Bible is may know what the tabernacle is, right? The tabernacle is a movable shrine, a movable religious structure, right? They moved it, they set it up, they put the Ark of the Covenant inside. Well, tabernacle normally means tent, right? A tent or tabernacle. The problem was the people that she was working with had no tents. They didn't have a word for it. Nobody had a tent. People didn't really move around like that from place to place. You had a village. In the village, you had a hut or a little house, and that was pretty much it. If you moved to another place, you'd have to get a different house, but you didn't move the house with you. So she had to figure out a way to represent a tabernacle. She ended up translating it as movable hut, a moving hut that they used for religious purposes. That's just one of the examples of the challenges. And part of the reason there's so many challenges is that there's so many languages in this part of the world. Now, another group, we've talked about Polynesian, but there is Malayo-Polynesian culture, which appears to be the ancestors of the current population of people in Malaysia, coming into play in about 2500 BC to 1500 BC in Malaysia and in Indonesia and in the Philippines. Where these people came from, that is, where they moved to get to these places, is still argued. Still arguments about it. But you can see elements in their culture and their language and their buildings that lets you know they are related to the mainland populations. So when we think about Southeast Asia, there are sort of three areas that we should be thinking about. You've got the mainland area, places like, say, China. But in Southeast Asia, you have lowlands, mountainous areas, and then remote islands. These three distinct areas end up with at least three distinct cultures, multiple cultures that develop in these different environments. So again, complicated. But also, I think, fascinating to see how these cultures develop. Now, I have a picture here. It's kind of hard to see. See these people? They're using a kind of bucket with ropes, one to the top and one to the bottom. They're lowering this down into the water. They're lifting it up and dumping it here into a channel. You see that? Remember I told you they have to irrigate the fields. Here's one method of irrigation. Obviously labor intensive. Well, in the lowlands, of course, they're growing rice. This is part of the work of growing rice, is irrigating the fields. In Vietnam, they have several rivers there. One of the rivers is called the Red River, in the Red River Delta area. We see here one of the major influences in Vietnam is going to be China. This area is conquered during the Han Dynasty. The Han Dynasty, if you remember it, is from roughly 200 BC to 200 AD. And so in Vietnam, there's a lot of Chinese influence. And the reason, what you find, if you even look at the map of modern countries of Southeast Asia, you'll notice that they are very narrow and very long countries, like Vietnam, like Laos, like even Cambodia, Thailand. Why? Because of those mountain ridges. The mountains separate Vietnam from nearby areas, and so there's a connection north to south that you don't have east to west. And coming from the north, the Chinese, when they are powerful, they expand into the territory of Vietnam. Well, another lowlands area is the Mong Khmer in Burma and the Mekong River with the Mekong Delta. Here we see another region of valleys, river valleys or lowlands, that has its own distinct culture. And then, of course, as we've already mentioned, the mountainous areas and the remote island areas we've talked about somewhat. So we've mentioned now Chinese influence, a lot of migrations of people from the mainland out in various waves and steps throughout Southeast Asia and out into islands. The Chinese directly taking control of Vietnam for periods of time when they're powerful, like say during the Han Dynasty. But there's another major influence we mentioned at the beginning, and that is India. The influence of India perhaps comes a bit later than that of China, but it is a powerful influence on Southeast Asia. You can see it through especially the influence of religion, the influence of Hinduism, the influence of Buddhism, the architecture. Well, we know that the influence of India on Southeast Asia begins prior to the 1st century AD, because we have reports from that period that by the time they get there, there's already stuff from India there. Temples, artifacts in the lowlands, all can be dated to at least the 1st century AD. How do we know about it? We know about it really because Chinese Buddhist missionaries travel to this part of the world in an attempt to evangelize the area for Buddhism. And when they get there, they record that they encounter several Hinduized kingdoms, or kingdoms that were basically followed the Hindu religion. Because again, we don't have really much written records. Most of the written records come in the form of people who visit and then write down what they found, like these missionaries, these Buddhist missionaries wrote down, when we got to Vietnam, we found, and we got to Southeast Asia, we found Hindu temples, what looked like Hindu temples, and what looked like Hindu objects, artwork, and artifacts. Well, how did this contact begin? You see this map that we have up here. It shows you where the Han Dynasty is. It shows you where the Gupta Dynasty is in India. Now, in between, of course, are the mountains of the Himalayas, Tibet and the Himalayas, which divides them. And then down here you have Southeast Asia. So it's not that far for people from India to come to Southeast Asia. It's not that far for people of China, especially to come to Vietnam, which is right here along the coast, but in this area as well. And by the way, today, most people are beginning to recognize, I've been saying it for years, that if you want to have great success in business, my recommendation is to learn Chinese, Mandarin Chinese or Cantonese language, or certainly have your children learn it, because perhaps by the end of this century, people might be calling it the Asian century, because the population is growing in this part of the world, in India and in China. Tremendous economic growth, population growth, and business. So some people have called the 20th century the American century. What are they going to call the 21st century? Well, the Chinese century, the Asian century, I don't know. I am not a prophet nor the son of a prophet, but I have been recommending for more than 20 years that people learn Chinese. No one takes me up on it, I don't think, but I still recommend it. Because in India, many people already speak English or some form of it. Right? If you've called any computer or technology helpline, you're talking to India much of the time. In China, they don't. So if you learn Chinese and you know English, well, you're gonna be able to succeed in business. Anyway, and perhaps in this century, I hope not, but perhaps in this century, I foresee there is going to have coming conflict between India and China over limited resources in that part of the world especially. But we'll see. Perhaps there'll be peace and harmony all around the world. I hope so. But if history's any indicator, we don't seem to get along very well with each other. Well, how did the contact begin? The people from India, it's believed, there's two theories. One is that they invaded. They simply sent a military in and invaded and took control. The second theory is that instead of militarily, it was merchants. It was trade. So they came as merchants. They came with products to sell or trade for the products that they had there. And this brought the influence. And then once the merchants had been there, then the missionaries and the religious influence followed. Well, this does follow something that, if you take the second half of this course, we will certainly see as Europeans spread around the world, as they will have colonies. Usually the first individuals to show up in that case were the missionaries, European missionaries. Then following them came the merchants, and then after that came the military. The 3 M's of colonial period of Europeans. So they came to evangelize the people, Once that happened, people realized it and they began merchant business trade, and then some kind of conflict came, then the military shows up. Well, in the highland areas, we certainly see the influence of the Gupta dynasty, certainly, and that's around 320 to 600 AD. All right, well, let's take a look at a few of the regions, a few of the areas in this region, actual kingdoms and so forth, that will emerge later. The first of these is known, usually called in a textbook as Funan. The Funan kingdom of the 1st century AD. And here you see a drawing of one of the buildings, one of the structures that has been damaged. But there's enough of it there to let you know that this is a Hindu-style temple or religious structure. This is in basically what today would be modern Cambodia. The name Funan is actually a Chinese transliteration, most people believe, of the word Phnom, which is Cambodian word for mountain, like Phnom Penh, which is one of the cities in that area still today. So Phnom became Funan with the in Chinese when they wrote about it. And so this name stuck. A Chinese traveler mentions Funan in the 3rd century AD and describes some of the Hindu influence from India that he observed while he was there. Funan then was primarily agricultural kingdom, but of course it does have some commerce. It's hard to see here because the water is not colored in. It's a black and white line drawing, but you do have a harbor here at Ak Yo. For example, at that harbor, Roman coins have been found. Now, what does that mean? That does not mean any Roman was ever there. Coins tend to be shared and transported long distances. Why? Because they're often made out of precious metals, like silver, gold. So in other words, coins can travel up and down trade routes. It doesn't mean directly that Romans were there, but it certainly means that there were lines of trade all the way from Southeast Asia to Rome. That, I think, is probably true. The Funan are probably ancestors of the modern inhabitants of Cambodia, known as the Khmer. So we see here is one of the early kingdoms of Southeast Asia, certainly with plenty of influence from India. Now we want to jump ahead from the 1st century all the way to the 9th, or the 800s, to the kingdom of Angkor. with his most famous place in Angkor that many tourists now visit is Angkor Wat, which is a temple complex in Cambodia. Hindu temples. Many people visit here every year. They go there just to see this complex. Some people come on cruise boats and take an excursion to Angkor. Angkor has had some of its statues and things sawn off the building and sold. Unfortunately, this kind of thing happens around the world with antiquities. But this is a powerful state in Southeast Asia, as you can see, for over 500 years. The founder was called Jayavarman, and he was the one who drove out invaders from Java. The capital was Angkor Thom, and we see some commerce here, but most of what they're doing here is agriculture. All right, let's move on. By the way, in the Angkor kingdom, they had lots of canals that they built, and they had lots of irrigation because, of course, they are a lot of times growing rice and other agricultural products. I will turn out the lights for a second and let you take a look at this. Kind of an ingenious irrigation system. You see the guy here is sort of like a bicycle-like structure. He pedals it. It has little, sort of a chain of little buckets that go down into the water, and then it brings it up and it dumps it into a channel here, and that goes out and irrigates the field. But again, hard manual labor. You've got to sit there and crank this thing probably all day. So that's like you guys, what is it, you go to what do they call those bicycles people go to now? People yell at them. What is it? Something cycle. Soul cycle, so does it, what do they call it? So, what is it? I lost you, okay. That's all right, someday you'll know. That's when you get out of college and people decide they're going to go to these places where other people are exercising. Well, we see many symbols, ideas from India, but also trade with China. Another major event that takes place that is mainly marked by religion will be an invasion that will come from the Thai people. From southwest China, this is going to end the Angkor civilization, and it will be a Thai invasion. One of the ways that it's marked is it brings a decline, a rapid decline to Hinduism in the area, and the rapid increase in Buddhism. So it becomes an interesting hybrid sort of situation where you have an Indian form of government, but religiously you have a Buddhist form of religion, which of course we often identify with China, because Buddhism really flourishes in China. Even though it originally began in India, it never was popular in India. I don't suppose it's still that popular in India today. But Buddhism then goes to China and other parts of Asia and becomes a dominant religion. The missionaries from China bring Buddhism in and start this Thai invasion. And then the Burman civilization, they moved south from Tibet about the 7th century AD, so in the 600s. They follow the government style of India, but they also will become Buddhists, and they begin what is known as the pagan kingdom. By the way, just a side note here, this has nothing to do with the word that we normally use for pagan. The pagan that we use in English, where we say if you're sort of non-Christian, right, you're pagan. Pagan actually comes from a classical world that's a world for the countryside, the rural places, because Christianity flourished in cities. And out in the countryside, people worshiped other gods. So out in the country, out in the pagan areas, you had people worshiping different kinds of religion. Well, you kind of see that with the Apostle Paul. He goes to the cities. The countrysides can remain. You know, it's kind of the opposite of our world today, I guess, where we see Christianity stronger sort of in rural areas and not as strong in the cities. Well, ultimately, this whole area in the 13th century is all weakened by the Mongols, and the Mongols come and sort of take over everything. Everything gets reshaped during that period, and we're going to talk more about the Mongols later. All right? So, we're going to end it there for now. Don't forget the extra credit tomorrow at 1 o'clock is available. We'll see you later.